Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers and me.
Hello and welcome to Tottenham Hotspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts. I'm Iain, and today I'll be reflecting on how the Spurs podosphere has been consciously uncoupling from Ange Postecoglou. Before I get into it today, a quick call to action. Thanks to everybody who's been sharing and listening to the show. If you could keep doing that, smashing that like button, subscribing, sharing it with your friends, that'll really help me to keep this ball rolling. You can follow me at ian.coys.social, the show at Tottenham Hotspur on Blue Sky, both of those, and you can email me at tottenhamhotspur@gmail.com. All of that's in the show notes. So, 5 days on from Ange Postecoglou being sacked as Tottenham manager? On reflection, probably not a huge surprise. I think maybe the manner in which it was done has surprised some people. I think that I had assumed that it wasn't going to happen after the Europa League win and had maybe convinced myself, hey, maybe Levy's going to give him season 3 after all. But that wasn't the case. There could be all sorts of reasons why we're in a period of flux right now across the club, both the men's team and the women's team. And I'll quickly mention the women. They lost their coach, Robert Wilhelm. I might have to dub over that. He was sacked just a few days after Ange kind of flew under the radar, I think, because of the amount of noise around everything happening on the men's side of things. But if you want to learn a bit more about the decision there and the process, I'd suggest you listen to the Tottenham Depot's discussion of both Ange and Robert's firings from Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. But of course, there's a lot more changes than just the head coaches of both men's and women's teams. We've lost Ryan Mason to West Brom, assistant coach. We're losing Scott Munn. Some of the other assistant coaches under Ange, probably not a surprise when a head coach departs. We've also said goodbye to Donna Marie Cullen, long-time board of director, leadership role at the club, a divisive figure amongst people, especially those who have worked closely with the club in the past. Who else? We've got Vinay Venkatesham coming in, new CEO. Daniel Levy has been suspiciously quiet. Maybe a bit more on that later. So just kind of a strange period. I think I'm ready to move on. I know it sounds like I have a choice in the matter. I have to be ready, right? It sounds like Thomas Frank is going to be announced in the next day or two. I'm half expecting to wake up tomorrow morning, US time, and have a bunch of messages on Blue Sky from people, celebrating a new coach or lamenting the choice or what have you. But before I dive into the podcaster analysis, I want to echo something that Ricky said on Last Word on Spurs, and that's thank you to Ange Postecoglou. He won't ever listen to this, but I think that it's polite to say thank you to people who've done very good things for you. And Ange has done something very wonderful for this football club. You can say what you like about the league form. People have said a lot about the injuries. I don't agree with them. But that night in Bilbao will live for many years to come, and it'll be something that we can tell our kids about. Was it a beautiful game? No. But was it perfect for us? Yeah, you're absolutely right, it was. So many podcasters that I listened to, and I think I got through a decent number over a dozen, I'd say, in the last few days. Many of them wanted to keep Ange, but were generally accepting of the decision. A lot of those had been Ange out prior to the Europa League final and changed their mind. I think that's fine. I don't really have an issue with this as a fan. I won't hold other people to a standard that I try to keep for myself. People can change their mind. It's just football. Who cares? And even if you're an influencer and you have a large platform, you feel how you feel. You do what you do in the moment. I try not to take people as too cynical about the changing and chasing algorithms. Maybe the way it's presented, but I think people feel how they feel. But yeah, there's a lot of people who thought that Ange deserved a chance after winning the Europa. He felt like he earned it. This was on The Fighting Cock, a few people on Dr. Tottenham. Ali Gold expressed it pretty well on Golden Guest Talk Tottenham, saying that it wasn't a sentiment, it was based upon a decision to want to see what our club, which is a club of change, can do with a foundation to build off of. So there's been this discussion amongst different podcasts of framing keeping Ange as being an emotional one and sacking him as being a logical one. And I think it really depends on the framework within which you're working. And we're all working in different frameworks. So it's not really worth debating. I don't like that language. I don't like the decision to call some people emotional and other people logical. It implies that one of them is right and one of them is wrong. Everything's a gamble. And maybe keeping Ange would have been a gamble that was worth taking, considering the gamble he took on us and his players back in February, supposedly. There's been a lot of discussion about how finishing 17th in the league isn't acceptable. I don't think this is debatable. There's a lot of mitigating circumstances regarding injuries, suspensions, Ange's supposed decision to prioritise, not necessarily focus, but just prioritise the Europa League. And I would say that I agree with his stance. And there's something interesting that I noticed in looking back through the previous year's Europa League winners. And I didn't look at the Conference League, I didn't look at the Champions League, just the Europa. So I look through the last 30 or so winners, dating back to Bayern and I think 1995, something like that. And so most of these, teams are finishing in the top 5 of their leagues, right? Sevilla's in there a number of times. Porto won their league the year that they won the Europa League back in 2002, back when it was the UEFA Cup. But of the teams that have finished outside the top 10 in their respective leagues, 3 of the 4 teams have come in the last 4 years, so kind of post-COVID. We've got Spurs finishing in 17th this year. Sevilla finished in 12th a couple seasons back, and Frankfurt before them finished 11th. And before them, you'd have to go back to, I think it's Schalke. Yeah, Schalke finished 12th in something like 1996. So there's just something that's happened. There's something about this competition that maybe drains teams in recent years. And I'll be interested to see who the winners are next season. Whether they're a team that's finishing high up in the table or what have you. Maybe it's also the draw of finishing in the Champions League. If you're up at the top of the table, perhaps you want to drive towards that rather than prioritise winning the Europa League. I don't know. Just an interesting correlation that I picked up on. Regarding mood, I'd say that most podcasters were pretty sanguine. I think a lot of people have either taken the time to process it, were generally sad, but accepting and trying to move on and trying to process it. The most extreme depressive state I saw or I listened to was on Are Tottenham TV. They were a very morose and very angry bunch in their reaction show that they put out not long after Ange's sacking had been announced. Large minority think it's the right choice, sort of unanimously across the podcast that they're on. I wouldn't say minimal regret, because I think they have regrets about a lot of things, but I don't think they necessarily mourn, if that's the way of looking at it. The Extra Inch, I would say, are a good example of this. The Spurs Show as well. Tim on Dr. Tottenham talking about how Spurs are acting like a big club by doing this. Shout out to Wheeler Dealer Radio, who told me through Blue Sky, Greg told me through Blue Sky that they were unanimous about Ange being the right choice. A conversation between Marlon on Spurs Kings TV with Hotspur TV was interesting because Hotspur looked like the cat that got the cream on the call. He was absolutely beaming. I thought Marlon handled him pretty well. Tried to bring him back down to earth, which is a strange thing to say after a manager's been sacked. Asking Hotspur whether Ange's first season in charge of Spurs was better than his second, to which Hotspur really had no good answer and dodged it entirely. I felt that Russ on Last Word on Spurs was incredibly blunt about Ange going, almost to the point of being insulting towards people who are sad about this. You know, we can be sad about things. We can be sad about movies, TV shows. You know, what's the difference between a football team that we've taken to heart and have loved since childhood in some cases? But he referenced Ange's faults, his dealings with the fans, especially cupping his ear, the tactics, the loss of love for life that was coming out of Ange, and the tactical play, the losses building up. He felt like Ange had been lying about, you know, especially things like the run in the league, I think. There was also a nameless pod that I don't want to mention. I don't want to give them airtime right now, frankly, due to a pretty tasteless tweet that I think they put out a few days ago. I don't even want to describe it, but they were incredibly blunt and very rude towards people who were sad about Ange Postecoglou being sacked. You know, the guy who just delivered us a trophy for the first time in 41 years in Europe, 17 in general. Don't be that person, please. Nobody needs to be that person. Let people just be upset if they want to be upset. Let them sit in their feelings for a minute. They're not hurting you. So, Jonathan Wilson came up a few times. Obviously a football sort of writer and journalist in general, not a Spurs fan. But he was asking about Spurs fans pre and post the Europa League win. What about that game changed our minds if you were Ange out before and Ange in afterwards? You know, because the game itself was pretty poor, in his opinion. You know, I was excited, but I can understand why the unwashed masses were upset about it. And I think Flav summed it up pretty well, and it's about what he felt, not what he saw. And this is a great example of Flav, once again, I think, capturing the mood of the Spurs fan base and pitching the tone right. In fact, the Fighting Cock reaction pod with Flav, I think Spooky and John Bass was pretty excellent in general. And that's true. That's how I feel. I gave something to me that you can't bottle, you can't sell in the club shop and slap a logo on it. That's what changed, and we want that to keep going. Or we want to, you know, roll the dice on it happening again. Or we want to reward people who do good things for us. Was there something about the game that I saw that changed my mind? Well, you know, I was kind of Ange-gnostic going into the final, probably leaning more Ange in. But what I saw in that game was a completely different Spurs team in a final than I've seen in years. A dogged determination to not lose. You know, Van de Ven clearing the ball. You know, Bissouma coming up with tackles. I think even Johnson had that dog in him to get that ball over the fucking line so that we could win that game. That's what I saw, Jonathan Wilson. No, I didn't see beautiful, free-flowing play. But I also didn't see James Maddison, Dejan Kulusevski, or Lucas Beraval in the middle of the pitch to help that happen. So I think this is an example of outsiders trying to challenge and stir opinions to bubble up and create content, which is, you know, a good thing in general. And I think it's a good question, actually. I just feel like it's maybe it's framed interestingly. Talking about framing a lot today. There's been a lot of debate about the players and what Ange's sacking means for the players. A lot of worry that this could unsettle a few people. Graham and Glenn on Tottenham Home and Away were talking about how, you know, maybe this unsettles Christian Romero, who people have assumed had a good relationship with Ange and is him sticking around is contingent on Ange being here next season. There's been an awful lot of discussion about the players' outpouring of, adulation for Ange on social media, etc. I don't know if I necessarily totally agree. I think this is a very raw time for these young men. They also have social media teams who are very savvy, so I think that getting content out, and particularly noticeable content, is a good thing for them. And they probably are going to miss him, but they're also professionals, and I expect them next season to move on. Ben Bowman disagreed. He did a short video that he put up on his YouTube channel. I think he referenced... Anyway, he disagreed. These are professional people. They'll come on and they'll do a good job for whoever comes in next. And I actually think this is a good motivating factor for them to prove that they are the ones who won that trophy as much as Ange led them to it. On the cheese room, Seb mentioned the video of Maddison sat on the bench. I think we were losing a game, or when Madders was referencing, you could see him, he hadn't covered his mouth, and he was saying something like, we're just playing the same old way again. It was something in that ballpark. The players haven't always been on Ange's side, and, these are people who work together. We like our colleagues, we drift away from them. Things happen, something monumental happens, we come together, you're galvanized. Who knows where they're at, but I expect them to be in a sad period, and I also expect them to be ready to move on come August 13th when we have another cup final. Before I wrap up on, just talking about the direct discussion of Ange, I did like the eulogy that was... Well, they didn't call it a eulogy, I'm calling it a eulogy. It had the tone of a eulogy that The Game Is About Glory had for Ange, saying that he leaves on a high. Other people have said he's martyred by this. And they also focused on what he gave to the players: confidence, inspiration, the fact that many of those young men have now won a trophy early in their careers. But in general, I think this period doesn't feel right, to quote Jack on Rule the Roost. Doesn't feel right. I can totally agree with that. There's something about the timing where I understand the logic of it. There's probably something to do with Ange's contract needing to get to 2 years to save some money, or for the CEO to come in, or not doing it too close to the trophy parade but you can do it afterwards because Ange was on vacation. I don't know. But I think that, and I think some of the fan sentiment around the statements that have been put out has also made it not feel right. Ash on CADS, I was fortunate enough to spend some airtime with him on that show on Friday. He suggested that he's thinking about spending a period of time away from Spurs because of this sacking. So I think that we need to be respectful of different people's approach to this. Ash is a long-time fan. He's seen a lot as a Spurs fan. If he's saying, this decision and this choice is something that makes him want to take a step back for a moment, I think we should pay attention to that. This isn't somebody being overly dramatic or hyperbolic. It's A, self-care, but B, reflective of a general malaise that's setting at the club that I think we're going to see addressed in the next 18 months, quite frankly. I hope so anyway. Whether that be management changes, player changes, or leadership changes, Levy, etc. Something that I did notice as I listened to podcasts through the week and as more podcasts came out is that there's an awful lot of looking forward. Some of this is because the news around Thomas Frank, the Brentford manager, currently the number one choice. He's already got the here we go from Fabrizio Romano, the tap-in merchant, who's just copying Brennan Johnson, the other tap-in merchant. And that's interesting. Something that caught my eye was the people who were on podcasts talking about Thomas Frank a lot earlier in this cycle. So booting back up my transcript analysis machine, which is me searching the podcast transcripts manually for the word Ange or Ange Postecoglou or Thomas or Frank or Thomas Frank, and then counting up by podcast, by date, to see how many times a podcast mentioned Ange, how many times a podcast mentioned Thomas Frank, and then looked at the ratio of the two. there's some interesting trends that come out. So this is basically how much is a podcast talking about Ange versus talking about Thomas Frank. And there's a general trend that early podcasts that came out, 6th or 7th of June, are more likely to be talking about Ange a lot more. The Game is About Glory comes out top of this table. They'll be pleased to find out. 43 mentions of Ange to 2 mentions of Thomas Frank, or thereabouts. It's not a perfect machine. And on the opposite end of the table, The Extra Inch, who published a podcast responding to Ange's firing on the 9th of June. And they mentioned Ange 33 times and Thomas Frank 40 times from what I can tell. So they talked about Thomas Frank more than Ange Postecoglou. And I think this just talks to the different way that people want to move on and want to process and what type of content they want to talk about. There were 4 podcasts, I think, that talked about Thomas Frank more than Ange Postecoglou. That was the Spurs Show on the 10th of June, the Fighting Cock on the 7th of June, Park Lane podcast on the 8th of June, and The Extra Inch on the 9th of June. All other podcasts talked about Ange more than Thomas Frank, from what I can tell. And I'll post that table up on Blue Sky. So I think moving on and processing is good. As one of the chaps on Last Word of Spurs said, we move on. A lot of people have been saying the king is dead, long live the king. There is some dissent, though. A dissent about the decision to sack Ange, and some dissent about the decision to prioritise signing Thomas Frank. He's generally seen to be an uninspired choice, kind of boring, kind of safe, kind of risk-averse. This is interesting, and a lot of the people who felt that this was the wrong choice really pointed to the lack of options out there. Some people were saying, Xavi is an option, or Zinedine Zidane, or get Klopp out of retirement, etc. But they acknowledge those are pie-in-the-sky ideas. There's just a lack of good quality managers the Spurs could go to, so why not roll the dice on Ange again? So, yeah, Thomas Frank, safer option. Some pods were keen to talk about him before Ange, in fact. Just coming back to that point about the ratio of Thomas Frank mentions to Ange Postecoglou mentions in a podcast. The YouTube contingent moved on pretty swiftly, in my opinion. Probably because of the algorithm, the need to keep drawing people's eyes to, clicking my fingers there for you, to their new content through, talk about Thomas Frank, and it's an exciting moment, isn't it? People who are in favour of him, there are people, there's a number of them who are in favour of Thomas Frank as a good choice. I think his transfers could be good. They like his pragmatic style, his flexibility. They think it might take him some time to initiate his way of playing, but they don't think it's going to be a big lift for the players. They like his personality. Say he's very personable, has high empathy for players, which I think will help in this moment, as some of them might be missing Ange. They say that his personality is, affable. It's in a way similar to Ange, but he has a different approach, perhaps more modern, as opposed to Ange's kind of old school approach to leaving the players to it. And just a last moment on Thomas Frank. I'm not going to put together a podcast after Frank is announced. I'm going to save that for the pre-season preview. I've no interest in reflecting on that straight away. I think it'd be nice to have some time to reflect upon what he's working with, what transfers he makes, who leaves, who stays, what his style seems to be in pre-season. And I'll leave you with a quote from Seb on the Cheese Room, who just called Thomas Frank another Nuno, and he wasn't the only person who said this. And Lord, I hope he's wrong. God, I hope he's wrong. If we're talking about sort of inflammatory statements, there was a lot of those directed at the board, namely Daniel Levy and Enoch. What a surprise, right? Particularly the club statement that was put out, full of statistics to back up their choices, not signed by Levy, cold, and especially compared to Ange's warm, grateful, sort of very tonally appropriate statement. It was stark contrast, and I think that riled a few people up. The timing, like as I mentioned earlier, has annoyed a few people. But, timing in general is an interesting point, because while we talk about Levy, Vasconi on Dr. Tottenham and Spooky on The Fighting Cock both mentioned that Levy has kept Ange on for far longer than we would have expected normally. Like, under normal business as usual under Levy, we could have seen him go back in February, January, try to salvage the season. But there's something changed. He kept Ange on, and it paid off, but obviously at Ange's own cost. So that's something to bear in mind. Is he did get a lot of time after things were slipping pretty badly, even if you take into account injuries, etc. Like, I think especially if you look at the manager churn that people have been referencing. Again, that nameless pod that I'm not gonna give airtime to. I did agree with them when I listened to them that we're not unusual compared to other clubs in terms of how often we sack our managers. It doesn't really feel like it, and they compared it to American sports culture where people have dynasties. I did look into some data for this. I didn't find a lot of great data, but the League Managers Association in 2024 pointed out that the average tenure of a Premier League manager is approximately 2 years. Not a long amount of time, but almost bang on for how long Ange got. I did look for Spurs in particular, so all I could find was for 2021 data from the Statista, and they said it was about 1.76 years for Spurs managers on average back in 2021, so a little bit lower. But like I said, Ange got approximately the league average in 2024, which isn't great. It's not awful. We move on. Speaking of Levy, Phil Cornwell on the Spurs Show really went in on Levy about our manager search, how long it took, assuming that it went back to January, only including 3 Premier League coaches, namely Glasner, Silva, and now Thomas Frank. Could we call him Frank? Is he one of these people who's a 2-name person? Has he got to be Thomas Frank? Could we call him Tommy? You can tell I'm getting tired because I'm kind of rambling. Lots of ITK. Lots of rumours about the board floating around. Like, a lot. I don't really want to touch upon it because who knows if it's true or not, and you're spreading lies. If you're interested in that type of thing, listen to Lee McQueen on Last Word on Spurs. He spoke about a lot of ITK, and if like half of what he says comes true, we've got more big changes coming. Generally speaking, I try to react to what's actually happened. And whether that be on this podcast or whether that be like in general with sports at the moment, I'm not really interested in kind of workshopping the future or trying to predict things. Like even this Thomas Frank stuff, I tried to stay out of it until like we're pretty close to it being finished. But good for people who want to play in that sandpit. That's just not for me. More Levy and Enoch stuff. Ash on Last Word on Spurs, so Ash from Spurs Kings TV. He's a guy I'm growing to like. I like his style. Called us a mess, and he's worried that the next step needs to be right, and then it won't be based upon previous with Enoch. There's a lot of worry in general. I mean, that was kind of the worry about sacking Ange from people, was like, are they going to get the next manager choice right? And so, yeah, a lot of people pissed off at Enoch right now. Park Lane podcast even ended with a round of Enoch out, Levy outs. So that kind of tells you all you need to know about where their head's at. A theme that I think I need to pay attention to over the summer and into next year is what all of this says about our identity as a football club. The Extra Inch had an entire section on what to dare is to do means to Bardi, Nathan, and Windy. I think that Bardi gave the clearest answer, which was that for him, to dare is to do means the style of play, attacking front-footed football, innovators. But there are different expectations about that for Tottenham Hotspur as a organisation in needing top 4 stability. Seb on the Cheese Room, I've mentioned him a few times in this one, still thinks we're a bit of a laughing stock. He pointed to the memes floating around online. So things like Spurs had to sack Postecoglou because he won a trophy, and they don't do that. Things like that. On the flip side, Phil Cornwell, Spurs Show, he felt that Ange has been able to take the Spursy jokes away from kids on the playground, which he valued. And, you know, in the last couple of months, I've heard people talk a lot about their children, whether they be adult children or whether they're younger, and how much they valued and wanted a trophy for them as much as the adults. And this is an example of that. You know, I think we can all remember being the Spurs fan on the playground and walking into school after something bloody stupid happens. This is a moment that their heads can be held high at school. It's really cool, and I value that. I liked my daughter being able to go into school, and although none of those kids in this American daycare really give two shits about Premier League football, she could look to her best friend whose dad is a Man United fan and be like, "We beat you," and that's pretty cool. So I agree with Phil there. Lee McQueen kind of agreed with us on another podcast, but pointing to the inability to use Warra Trophy, that awful phrase that gets hurled at Spurs fans on X or Instagram or whatever, just kind of nonsense. The Fighting Cock, Ash on Last Word on Spurs. I think Graham and Glenn on Tottenham Home and Away all asked, what does this say about what we want to be as a football club, though? Do we want to be a football club that wins things? Or do we want to be a football club that finishes in the top 10? I can come back to that question from Marlon on Spurs Kings TV, you know. Was season 1 better than season 2? Like, sure, season 1 we finished, 5th or whatever? Season 2 we won the Europa League. Like, I wouldn't change that for the world. But, you know, in the grand scheme of things, if we were to get 5th for a couple years, you could look at the last few years and say, yeah, they finished 4th, 5th, won the Europa League, and then finished 5th twice. Like, that's not bad. More about identity and sort of more Levy bashing in a way. Todd on the Tottenham Depot pointed out how we seem to have a history as a football club of stopping or having our momentum stopped, either in the case of, you know, COVID or sacking Jose Mourinho days before a final, sacking Ange shortly after a final. It never feels like we can capitalize upon the momentum that we're building. Pochettino being sacked not long after the Champions League run. You know, there's context in all those cases, but I can kind of see what he's saying about momentum and that being important. Of course, now I'd feel like these players do have momentum, and I think that there's the opportunity for them to generate their own momentum, which I think the top players really have. They're kind of forces of inertia to win things, and I hope that that's lit a fire under them to be those types of players moving forward, especially the young guys like Lucas and Archie Gray, Mikey Moore. A lot of people are just seeking stability, though, in terms of identity. You know, a lot of conspiracy talk about this, and only being able to get this if Levy goes through hook or by crook. It's interesting that some people are talking about momentum, some people are talking about stability, and obviously these are at different levels of the football club. I think there's a safety aspect in both of them, right? In terms of momentum, it's like sharks needing to keep swimming or they die, right? That's the safety aspect. Whereas others want kind of stability in general, kind of like a warm blanket, right? Finishing in the top half of the table or higher if preferable, like frequently. That's safe, that's stable, it's cozy. I don't know, maybe we need a little bit of danger, though. You know, truth is probably somewhere in the middle, right? You need a little bit of stability to give you a foundation to work off of, but perhaps you need to be a risk taker to be a Tottenham Hotspur and win trophies. And that's what we should be, right? That's the dare is to do aspect. Take a risk. And either way you look at it, sacking Ange, that's a risk. Keeping Ange, that's a risk too. Just gotta hope that it pays off. So, all in all, this is a confusing period, as I said by Joe on the So Spurs podcast. This is an apt end, hopefully, to a confusing period. And it sounds like a lot's changing with the board and with Ange. And, you know, if Sonny does end up going, we're in the last year of Ben Davies's contract, although he might go to Wrexham this year. It's the end of the Pochettino era. Jack on Rule the Roost felt that the Europa win was kind of a cap on that era. And it's an interesting take that maybe we've had too many eras that we haven't been able to process and move on from. You know, Poch never really got his swan song. He was sacked in the middle of November. Mourinho was sacked right before a cup final. Conte blew up, after a horrendous personal season for him. I would say that us winning a trophy has been able to close off many different chapters of Tottenham Hotspur, which have been left unfinished in the last 10, 15 years. Maybe even ENIC as a whole. I've referenced the conspiracies that we might be selling to Malaysians or Qataris or whoever. The Europa win would kind of be a crowning achievement for that particular, organization running our football club. I think that it was in spite of them, not because of them, but it still happened under their watch with people that they hired and money that they moved around the football club. So if you're looking for a podcast to listen to that really just sums everything up, puts a nice neat bow on it, gives you some good feels, I would highly recommend Vince Rugari's interview on The Lab. For those of you who don't know him, Vince wrote the Ange book that's been mentioned a lot, if anything too much, over the last 2 years. And he's an interesting guy. He seems to have developed an affection for Spurs as a football club that he says will persist. He's on a Spurs podcast saying it, but he's got no reason to lie. He's got Spurs in-laws, he says. He says that the club kind of wears him well, even with Ange going. So I think there's a lot of good emotion in that podcast. You're not going to get two people arguing about whether Ange was the right choice or not, but just two people enjoying what he did. Two people who generally have been Ange supporters. Flav has been Ange in for a long time, if not, wanting to be Ange in. I think that goes a long way. So yeah, I would check that out. So yeah, just to wrap all this up, I've got to try and tap into some emotions here. I will mention something that Steph referenced on The Game Is About Glory about all of this, and the move is not giving up by sacking Ange. It isn't, stopping the journey. The journey continues. We're just taking a slightly safer route to glory. And as always, Steph has a way of putting poetry on on a football club. Enjoy that. So, with all of this, we have to find our moments of joy, right? Like, enjoy those Ange comps, the quotes, him talking about, his childhood, what this means to him, all the player celebrations, that wonderful, wonderful parade. And the other stupid stuff that's happened amongst all this too. I mean, we've really got to enjoy the fact that this happened. Ange was sacked whilst Alistair Gold was on vacation. Another thing that happened while Ali took a trip. And for those of you who don't know, there's this weird coincidence where Alistair Gold goes on vacation and then huge news drops, and I don't know why. So he had to record a video from his hotel bedroom after Ange was sacked. The poor guy. It's almost like Levy's deliberately trying to fuck with Alistair Gold specifically. It's crazy. It's like he cut him off in line for breakfast once at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. I don't know what it is. It's great. But you have to acknowledge that the big win came at a time for some people that personally is pretty tough. And I have to say, I don't talk about this a lot. But this past 6 months has been a really rough time for me. I know I started a podcast and all this other shit, right? But I think it's more of a distraction than anything else. There's a lot of things happening in the world. I live just outside Washington, D.C. My job has been subjected to a tremendous amount of instability. I've said goodbye to way more colleagues than I ever expected to in a short period of time. Good people hardworking people. We lost somebody just this week due to bullshit. And where I'm going with this is that I didn't think that I was like ready to say goodbye to Ange as much for footballing reasons as for what it represents in terms of holding on to this amazing moment for a little bit longer. You know, this Europa League win, it's been 2 weeks on and I'm like, oh man, I wish we had more time to enjoy this. I think it's just trying to hold on to the really amazing thing that happened in spite of everything else that's kind of shitty that happens in the world, right? And when we're talking to people who are online who are saying like, oh, you know, I'm so sad about this, or I'm still processing it, or whatever, like there's a lot of stuff that's going on for folks. And I'm just giving my example of like why perhaps coming into recording this podcast, I'm a little lower energy than normal. I didn't think I was going to dread it until I was kind of setting up my my desk, and I thought, fuck me, you know, I am actually sad about this. I'm sad about a football manager going, and I, you know, took a few steps to just think like, why? And I think it's that what I said. The Europa League win was an amazing thing in like a sea of shit that I've been swimming around in for the last 6 months. Haven't lost my job, but could be real close to it, you know. But we're in a transitional moment. Joe on So Spurs said this. I'm getting back into podcast mode. This is a new opportunity to be excited again. Ange was a victim of circumstances. Transfers didn't support him, really. Injuries didn't help him at all. And fuck anybody who tries to blame them on Ange. I won't name the podcast who did, but there are a few. Bentancur being racist. The cup success, I think he almost worked against him. If he hadn't chased that and finished, you know, top 8 or something, I don't know, he might still have a job, and that's crazy. Ange is a legend. Sonny called him a legend. More importantly, the lads on Wicked Spursy called him a legend. And he is. And how many legends that have joined our wonderful football club in the last 10 years have we been able to attach a trophy to? 0. Last 15 years, 0. Last 20. Okay, Ledley maybe, right? Keane. Berbatov, right? This is a special moment. Ange is gone. Somebody else is coming in. Let's not sully this moment. Let's enjoy it. Let's process it. Do our best. And bring on August, you know. Let's see what we can do next year. We got a bunch of hungry players with a point to prove, and I'm excited to see what they do. If it's Thomas Frank, I can't wait to see what he wants to do with our wonderful football club as the new custodian of our hopes and dreams. So with that, I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening again. I do value the people who want to take the time to listen to me talk for half an hour about Spurs podcasts. I've said before, I think they're great eyes into the soul of our fan base, and I enjoy doing it. I hope you enjoy it too. So I'll close out. Thanks for listening. My name's Iain. Follow me online, yada, yada, yada. Keep listening to and keep making Spurs podcasts, and keep watching that trophy parade.